Hello everyone, welcome back to AS and A-Level Biology with Dr. Demi. I am Dr. Demi. If you have been watching all my videos from chapter 1 by now, you know this is me. And I am going to record the last two sections of chapter 19 and upload them here. And usually when I get to these sections in the classroom, by the way, I no longer teach, but when I used to be in the classroom, whenever I got to these sections, I would get the students to have more of a conversation, and in some cases they would even have debates. So we've had lots of debates about genetic modifications. For example, should you genetically modify your baby if you can afford to? Is it okay for us to genetically modify plants? And these debates then lead to a wider conversation about the ethical and social impacts of genetic technology. But since you're all here on YouTube, we can't necessarily do that, but I would appreciate if you would maybe post your ideas or your thoughts about genetic technology in the comments and just interact with your colleagues, because that would be great. While you're doing that, I will just get into the technical aspects that you have to know for your CAIE exams and maybe just give you some additional understanding on the current state of things. So this section is genetic technology and agriculture. So if you live in a country where genetically modified plants are being sold, then you're probably aware of the fact that some of them are most of them are produced for their resistance to herbicides and to insects as well. But in some cases, they're also produced for the sake of improving your culinary experience, if we want to call it that. So for example, when you go to the shops and you buy a punnet of grapes and those grapes don't produce any seeds, so your seedless grapes that you enjoy, there is a high chance that those grapes have been genetically modified to not produce seeds. And obviously this has led to a wider debate in many regions, because people then say you are messing up the natural state of the fruit and preventing people from access to seeds, except they are bought commercially. This is an indication of the kinds of debates that come up in my classroom when I teach this topic. And so I have students get into teams and they debate each other out and just share what their thoughts and opinions are. Sometimes I make them go for and sometimes I make them go against, but it is really fun. So again, if you have any thoughts about this, please by all means post them in the comments. What do you think of genetically modified plants where you live, and how do people react to them when they know about them? So again, like I said, most genetically modified plants are produced for their resistance to herbicides. In case you're unsure of what a herbicide is, that is this word over here. A herbicide is basically a plant or a formulation that is used to kill unwanted plants. So when you plant your crops, say for example you decide to plant grapes, you will always have weeds that come up between those grapes. And when I say weeds, I don't mean the one that everyone smokes these days. I mean unwanted plants, basically, that come and suffocate your actual plant by stealing nutrients from the soil and also preventing it from being able to access water properly in the soil. So herbicides are used to kill these weeds, and genetically modified plants can be resistant to herbicides because they've been genetically modified to be that way. Genetically modified plants can also be resistant to insect pests, and I think there's an example here on this video that I will show you. And sometimes genetically modified plants are used to enhance nutrition, as in the example of vitamin A enhanced rice. So usually when people talk about genetic modified foods, they speak about how this can be expected to solve the world's food crisis, because when we genetically modify plants, thinking back to the videos that I did on genetic modification, it's really a matter of altering their DNA in order to cause them to express certain traits, and those traits can be selected for and they can be favorable. So for example, you can decide to make a plant that is not affected by a certain insect, because that insect, maybe whenever it gets close to the plant is able to produce a toxin that kills the insect. But I'll explain this in more detail. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide so that you don't get bored. So just looking at the importance of genetic modified plants, there is an example, for example, in oilseed rape. Oilseed rape is very commonly used nowadays as canola oil. In its natural state, oilseed rape has two compounds that are not suitable for consumption, and that is one that we call erucic acid and another one that is called glucosinate, or glucosinate is a group of compounds. But when you modify this genetically, you actually enable the plant to produce less erucic acid and less glucosinate glucosinates, and as a result of that make it fit for human consumption. When the erucic acid is high and the glucosinates are high, what you get is an oil that is more suitable as a biodiesel fuel and not something that people should be consuming. But by genetically modifying it, which means by altering the DNA or maybe changing some section of the DNA of the plant, you make it produce less erucic acid, less glucosinates, and as a result of that, people consume it. And that is what you call canola oil these days. So when you go into the shops and you say, I want a jar of canola oil, you are buying genetically modified oil, that's oilseed rape, that has been now that has been modified in order to produce less erucic acid that would have been harmful to your health. Also, something that makes genetically modified plants very important is the fact that when people have very wide farmlands, so for example, let's say you are a commercial grape farmer, and I'm using grapes a lot in this video because I love grapes. So if you're a commercial grape farmer, you probably don't plant just 10 grape plants, and then when you harvest those 10 plants, you're able to make your millions of dollars or rands or British pounds, whatever it is that you're spending. So you have a vast area of land, and what that means is that it might be very difficult for you to be able to go through the land, every single day trying to get the weeds out so that they don't compete with your grapes, overpower them, and prevent them from growing. And so genetically modified plants are plants that can also withstand what is called the herbicide, which I explained on the previous slide. The herbicides can be sprayed on these genetically modified plants without affecting them, which means that when you spray the herbicide on the plants, the weeds that try to compete with the plant will die, but the plant itself has been genetically modified to withstand that herbicide, and so it doesn't die. An example of this is glyphosate and also glyphosate. And you might have heard in the news recently that glyphosate is beginning to receive a lot of heat because it is now being seen as a probable carcinogen, which means it might cause cancer in people, but it is also being now reported for its biochemical effects on people. I might do a different video on that one as additional understanding. This is more about what you should know for your exams. So you should know that examples of herbicides are glyphosate and glyphosate. You can also have genetically modified tobacco, and tobacco has been made resistant to 2 herbicides in particular, and those are their names. You don't need to know their names, but basically what this means is that when people grow tobacco, and if you look here in the picture, you can see that these are nice tobacco plants that have been grown. I'm just going to use a white pen this time, and you can't see any competing weeds in between. Sometimes without herbicides, you might find that there's a different plant that's growing somewhere here, and it is stealing nutrients from the tobacco plants that are next to it. But that doesn't happen if you're able to genetically modify the tobacco, make it resistant to the herbicide, and then spray the entire area with herbicides so that no weeds can grow and the tobacco plant can also survive. The detrimental effects of genetically modified plants is that they can become agricultural weeds themselves. What this means is that, say for example, I decide to maybe have a farm that's not too far from this tobacco farm, and on my farm I am planting papaya, or what you might call pawpaw if you're from West Africa. I'm just going to write that down because I just realized that for some people it might be a very different, it might be completely different. So in West Africa, I know it's called pawpaw, but I know in some parts it is called papaya. So say for example, next to this tobacco farm, I have a papaya farm, and in my papaya farm, everything's all good and dandy. And I don't use any herbicides at all. I'm maybe an organic farmer. The guy next door who uses the tobacco, who has the tobacco farm and plants herbicide-resistant tobacco, might create what we call an agricultural weed. What this means is that the tobacco is able to withstand a herbicide that if it starts growing next to my papaya, for example, and I say, okay, well, in this case, I also need to use a herbicide. If I spray the herbicide, there's a chance that the tobacco will not die because it has been made resistant. So that is one of the detrimental effects of genetic modified crops. Sometimes you can also have pollen transfer between genetically modified crops and what we call the wild relatives. Wild relatives mean that they are organic, they have not been genetically modified. So if you have pollens that are taken from a genetically modified crop and you transfer them to one that is not genetically modified, you will produce what we call hybrid offspring, and those hybrid offspring will themselves become weeds. So that itself can become a problem. Herbicide-resistant weeds can also evolve because so much of the same herbicide is being used over time, which means that even though this farm at the moment does not have any weeds, at some point there might rise a plant that would say, okay, I know how to beat this thing, and it develops resistance the same way bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics. And as a result of that, the weed becomes resistant to the herbicide itself, and so even when you use the herbicide, the weed does not die, which then creates another problem because now you would have to find a different herbicide or maybe make a stronger concentration. And a stronger concentration cannot be said to not affect your actual plant. So these are some of the detrimental effects that you might face. We also have insect-resistant crops, and this is something that many people might not be aware of, that you can genetically modify plants to prevent them from being attacked by insects. For example, if you're a maize farmer and you plant maize, you're probably aware of different diseases that affect maize. An example is by this insect called different insects. An example is by this insect called the corn borer, and what it does is that it eats the leaves of the maize plant, and then it also bores into the stalk of the plant itself, that's of the corn, of the maize. And by boring, what it means is that it sort of like digs a hole into it and it eats into the entire plant. And this is a problem because imagine if you are a commercial farmer and you have planted on your vast farm of land or your vast farmland this this maize crop, and you're hoping to harvest and make certain millions of dollars or rands or pounds, whatever it is that you spend, and now there's this insect that comes and starts to eat into it. What that means is that your harvest would be a lot lower than you expect, and you will probably lose a lot of money. And this is why people make insect resistant crops, and again, by doing that, they change the DNA of the crop so that it is able to fight against the insect by itself. Cotton, for example, is a crop that is protected against pests such as the boll weevil. That is what its pest is called. And you also have insect resistant tobacco, but at the time that this was put together, it wasn't commercially produced, but I'm pretty sure it is in commercial production at the moment. I think I'll share with you a little bit how this is made on the next slide. But one of the benefits of having an insect resistant plant is that it means you use less pesticides. So you use less, because herbicides, remember, kill weeds, so they kill unwanted plants. Pesticides are another group of chemicals that are used to kill insects that might affect your crop. So by making the crops themselves insect resistant, you will not have to use any pesticide. And this again helps with the evolution of resistance by insect pests, which means that the pests are not able to develop resistance. But also the issue is that the other issue with it is that it can have a damaging effect on other species of insects. So for example, you might make an insect resistant crop that is supposed to attack a particular insect, but the toxin produced by the crop might then start attacking other insects, which would then create a problem because those insects might be agriculturally required or agriculturally necessary. Also, you can have the gene again being transferred through pollens to other plants, and that can create a problem. So let's talk about one of the insect resistant crops, for example. So there's a toxin called the Bt toxin, and it was isolated from Bacillus thuringiensis, and this bacteria produce different toxins that can be used against different insect species. So what has been done is that the gene that produces the toxin, so I'm just going to draw here so that you sort of get it. So let's assume this is the bacteria and it has a circular DNA. Okay, and let's say this section of its DNA that I'm coding here in black, in case you're wondering what I'm doing because you're not following my ink on the top, please look to the top. So here's the bacterial DNA, and that black section over there is what produces the Bt toxin. Okay, we can then go to the plant DNA, and for this sake, I'm just going to draw the plant DNA as a rectangle, because we know the plant DNA is a bit more complex than that, but I'll just draw it as a rectangle. What we can then do is that using the things like our restriction enzymes, which you spoke about when I taught you the principles of genetic technology and so on, is we can go in there and we can cut out this section of the DNA that produces the toxin and then transfer it into the plant. Okay, so now we put it into the plant DNA, and then it is integrated into the plant. What this then means is that when you plant this crop and it starts to grow, it will start to produce the toxin by itself. And by producing the toxin, it means that when insects that are supposed to be affected by this toxin come close to the plant, they will naturally die. So it's a way of sort of putting an insecticide within the plant itself. Obviously, there are so many questions around this that people ask, such as, doesn't this make people sick? Because imagine if you also get close, doesn't that have an impact on you? If you use an insecticide in your house, for example, you're usually advised not to stay inside the house so that you don't get affected by the insecticide. So what is the impact of this? Again, that is a video for additional understanding. This is just covering the facts of what you need to know for the exam. So crops that have the Bt toxin, for example, are able to produce the toxin themselves. They have the gene rather. They're able to produce their own insecticide, and as a result, they can kill insects. The problem, however, is that some insects can develop resistance to this toxin, which means that the insects have sort of figured out how the toxin works, and so they're still able to affect the plant anyway. So that means that having a lot of plants, and this again plays along the lines of what happens with antibiotic resistance, that having a lot of plants that produce the Bt toxin can result in many of the insects that should be affected developing resistance to the toxin itself. And as it says here already, there is a high resistance by corn borers to the toxin in the USA, because the USA is one of the countries where this is being used. You also have Bt maize, and what Bt maize does is that it produces the toxin in its pollen, and that pollen is carried by the wind. Now again, this is another question for debates that students usually engage in, that if this is carried by the wind, what impact is it having on people who are nearby, and how is it affecting our response to the environment today? Obviously, you might be able to tell that when it's pollen season, many people get sick, and it seems like it gets worse every single year. That again, another video for additional understanding, but I'm bringing these up because I would really love for you to post a comment just sharing your thoughts around this. Leaves that come from genetically modified maize plants can sometimes end up in the rivers, and they can be eaten by insects, and then that would then prevent the growth of those insects because the leaves are carrying this Bt toxin in them. And wherever you have Bt maize, there has been a reduction in microbial diversity. This is considered a bad thing because it means that you might affect the soil integrity because of this toxin, and you don't have the necessary bacteria and fungi and all of these other microorganisms that help with successful healthy soil formation. And so this is one of the disadvantages of this. Another disadvantage is that genetically modified seeds are very expensive, and most of the time when you find that crops don't produce seeds, so for example when you eat your seedless grapes, it simply suggests that the planters, so the farmers, would have to buy the seeds from a commercial producer. And obviously we're not going to name any of them, but if you want to just add any comment regarding this, again, please do so. And now an advantage of genetic modification is vitamin A rice. So it was found that in many countries where rice is a staple, so maybe in parts of Asia and also in parts of Africa, you would find that where rice forms a major part of the diet, there's usually a vitamin A deficiency. And vitamin A deficiency can cause blindness and also cause an immune deficiency syndrome. Vitamin A is fat soluble. You find it in oily fish and in foods that like eggs, milk, cheese, and also liver. And it can also be made from the carotene that is found in carrots. In case you're wondering what carotene is, it is the pigment that gives carrot its color. But what you also find is that vitamin A can be found in what we call the aleuron layer of rice, but not in the endosperm. So in the white rice that is very common, and I'm sure you've seen white rice wherever you live, the aleuron layer of the rice has been removed. In brown rice, if you you notice when you eat brown rice, it does have a little bit of a tough texture to it. It's a bit different. But in brown rice, the aleuron layer is intact. However, if you store it for a while, it makes the rice go bad. So the endosperm that we eat in white rice doesn't have that aleuron layer, which means it doesn't have the carotenoids that make vitamin A. In brown rice, it is there, but because of its effect on the rice itself, it can make the rice go bad. So what then has been done? Genes have been taken from different plants, so from daffodils and also from a soil bacterium, and those genes have been introduced into rice in order to make the rice produce carotenoids into the endosperm. So if you're going to remove the aleuron layer, you can have the carotenoids being produced in the endosperm layer of the rice, so that when people eat it, they can still get vitamin A. And what that has resulted in is this golden rice color that you now see here on the slides, and I'm sure this is not very common in some places, but in some places it is quite common. So golden rice is a vitamin A rice rather, that is sort of being used to address the issue of vitamin A deficiency in places where rice is a staple. So that is it for genetic technology and agriculture, and I'm sure you're like, what kinds of questions can come on this? Usually when you get questions about this, they're questions that are sort of asking you, what is the disadvantage of using an insecticide? What is the advantage of using it? Sometimes they give you some data to analyze and ask you questions based on the data, but it is a very common sense section of the chapter, and I believe that if you watch this video and maybe do some parts papers, you should be fine. I'm going to stop here for now. That is all that I will be sharing with you today. Until the next video, goodbye.